Hello, everyone. This is Ayush, your host, and I do this podcast where I host incredible people and get their worldview on topics I'm super curious about. I'm glad to have you here, and today I have with me David King, who I almost always call David Kind because of the kind human being he is. He's an early Google employee. He has seen it all, right from dot-com bubble to the social media race to the AI madness that is going on right now. He has spent last 23 years in Silicon Valley, has been an early Google employee and an early investor in companies like Cora, Cambly, Clubhouse, so on and so forth. Also Pesto. We're grateful to have you here with us, David. Thank you so much for taking our time.
Thanks for welcoming me, and wow, what an intro. I really appreciate it.
Welcome on the show. I think we
Thanks.
would love to start all the way back when you started your career. Was Google your first company where you worked?
No, I had started with this company called Trilogy, which was in Austin, Texas. And it was kind of like the Y Combinator of its day. It sort of encouraged a lot of entrepreneurial people to come and kind of had a little bit of an incubation flavor to it. You know, this was like in 2000. So.
But what made you get attracted towards tech?
Well, I've had, computers. I was fortunate to, grow up in a house where my dad was like a CPA and always wanting to like have better information structure and organization. So he was, getting us a new computer every couple of years from like my whole life, basically, back
That's
when.
awesome.
And so I was like playing on the internet in, like the 80s.
I didn't know there was an internet before 80s.
It was very shaky. It was a lot more like the BBS. Do you know the BBS scene?
No.
Like this is like bulletin board systems. You used to
gotcha. Okay.
dial in from a dial-up modem.
Yeah.
Dial into like your, some hub, and it's basically, it kind of felt like Mastodon, where
Gotcha.
there's like one ruler of that BBS, and he sets the rules and he tells you what you're allowed to do or kicks
Got
you
it.
out if you're being mean.
I would love to understand how a dot-com bubble felt like. But before that, I would love to ask you this question, that how dot-com bubble felt like, what comes close to it in like last 2 decades or so?
Oh, geez. Well, the dot-com stuff was like this huge influx of enthusiasm, which brought talent and capital, and everybody assembled because we're like, wow, the internet is going to change everything, and e-commerce there's going to be thousands of e-commerce companies that are all successful, and somebody's going to sell like sports gear, and somebody's going to sell like, living room furniture, and somebody's going to sell books. And everybody kind of like dreamed of this amazing future. And so all this capital came to flow in and support that. And, all the infrastructure, there's no infrastructure for the internet. So all of that got built, like dark fiber under the sea and stuff like that. And it was a real build out. And I think what turned out is like people got over their skis, as they, often do with capitalism, get overly excited and then overly pessimistic. and then of course, Amazon grows up and does everything. All 1,000 of those companies are just Amazon.
Yeah, that's crazy. You still didn't answer my question though.
Yeah.
That was a good dodge.
What feels similar, right? So I think every time something big happens, it feels kind of like that. Like everybody gets way too excited. Like search was this for a while. Social networking was this for a while. Social apps, mobile apps.
Yeah.
The sharing economy, crypto. Now I think we're in AI, right? So every time something happens and people are like, wait, the world's about to change. There's this new technology. There's new primitives that we can play with. Everybody gets like overly excited. Like there's going to be $10 trillion of value created in mobile apps. Well, I don't know. There's probably like they're very impactful, and there's like a handful of successes. It's not like even hundreds. There's like dozens of really, really big, substantial, maybe half dozen things that are like really, really knockout substantial.
That's awesome. Do you still think like crypto might have had like a period of slump at this point with excitement going away? But do you think there will be something substantial there as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is like a kind of a controversial topic because I think a lot of people in tech sort of have this crypto Web3 ideology, and that's not me at all. I've sort of spent a lot of time in the space. I have come to the conclusion through a lot of like work and study and learning that Bitcoin is the thing. That is the decentralized technology. It only really does value and payments. It doesn't do world computing and smart contracts and blah, blah, blah. But it does that one thing really well, and it does it in a really good decentralized way. And I think we've barely built anything around it yet. Like we're just at the beginning of that. So I think that's like a multi-decade process to get Bitcoin out into people's hands, and we're going to have apps and infrastructure and even social networking things that depend on a world where Bitcoin exists, but they aren't new blockchains, they aren't new Web3 crypto things. All the builders are coming in and building on Bitcoin is still kind of at the edges. But I think that's going to become like multi-decade thing that's still going to just keep pushing forward, and we're going to see lots of activity and energy and building there.
The excitement around AI is probably peaking, right? Do you draw similar comparisons to dotcom bubble with AI coming in?
Today, technology is so mainstream. Comparing things to the dot-com bubble, dot-com was like such a weird niche, Silicon Valley mostly thing. And now the internet is global, social networks are global, technology is global. And so I think AI is going to be global, and it already is. And I think the continued development of it is going to just be really exciting. We're going to have way too much capital allocated. So much of it's going to wash out. But then from that, we're going to find the winners.
There's a graph of pace of adoption of different kinds of technologies in last 100 years or so, right? And that graph basically shows that, okay, like telephone was invented beginning of the century, but took almost more than 70 years to get mass adoption. And then we had like this moment where Pokemon Go was downloaded in every phone in a single day, right? Do you think AI will probably be much faster? I mean, that's obvious, it will be, but how fast will it be?
Now, to address your kind of like pace of distribution issue, I think like the refrigerator is really hard to distribute, right? Like you have to go into a shop and evaluate the options and buy it, and they have to ship it to you. That takes forever compared to anything digital. The dot-com days, you didn't even have like all the digital infrastructure. You couldn't access websites. So I think you first need to build out the infrastructure, but then once everything's digital, these things can happen overnight, because when we have more technologies, they build upon each other, right? And AI, we're just at the beginning of it. But like it's great because it's going to cause us to allocate a lot of capital and attention and talent towards AI, but we don't really know what we're going to do with it ultimately. I think we haven't seen the best use cases yet. The things that we see and think are interesting are actually probably not that interesting. The things that are really going to blow our minds and change the world probably haven't been invented yet.
We are sitting in 2033. What's your version of Black Mirror episode looking like?
Season 15. March forward of technology, I approach as an optimist. And so I wouldn't necessarily characterize a Black Mirror episode. I mean, if you look at like what it felt like when I was growing up to what it felt like when I kind of became, entered the workforce in my career, and then what it feels like now, I think it's accelerating in the last 10 or 20 years versus maybe the first 20 years for me. And I think the next, even 10 years, we're going to see more change than the recent 20 years. I feel like there's a lot of innovation happening in all directions. And I don't think any of that's going to slow. I think it's just going to accelerate in all directions. What about self-driving cars? We in San Francisco,
self-driving cars
in
is
San
huge.
Francisco, we take self-driving cars around the city. If I were, starting out in the world today, how would I sort of decide what to work on, right? Because I think the most important thing is to identify the people you want to work with, and to identify good people that you want to spend your time with, that you're going to be able to contribute to, that you're going to be able to grow professionally with, and the problems that intrigue you. So, right, like you can use the problem set of things that, the things that you keep wanting to read more about, you keep wanting to learn more about. You're like, why does it work that way? I can't figure that out. Where is this going? When you want to ask those questions, I think that's a good signal. But the people where you talk to them and you're like, oh, this person has some unique insights. They might be good at selling a dream or a vision, but it's also rooted in reality.
Makes sense.
It's not just hype. I think one of the most critical elements to judge is, can you decide if the thing we're talking, like you're inspired, but then it grounds in reality, and you're like, I see where we are and how we get there. And it's those people that you want to work with.
That makes so much sense. And I think it also reminds me of life in Silicon Valley. When you moved there back in 2003 or 4, is that when you moved back from Austin?
2000. Yeah.
How was it like when you first moved there?
It was right at the end of the dot-com. So everything .com had crashed.
Oh, so
everybody was unemployed. and there wasn't like this thriving ecosystem of startups. At that time, we're working on, effectively I'd call it like web enterprise software. And we had I think we had $10 million in revenue, this tiny little startup. And we couldn't raise any venture capital.
Oh, wow.
It was just like, everybody was like, nope, it's off. It's
$10 million in 2001? That's a lot.
Yeah.
And you couldn't raise any capital.
Yeah.
Were there any funds around at that time? Or
Yeah,
venture
there were
capital
plenty,
was-
but there was no appetite for risk. There was no appetite to build a better future.
Moving on to Google,
Yes.
which is highly successful.
Yeah.
Right? You were an early Google employee.
Yeah.
How was it like? How was the energy in the company? And what was it like working there?
Yeah, it was this weird thing because,
Yeah.
it was search and ads. That was like the core business, still the core business today.
Yeah.
But it wasn't even Gmail or Maps or any of the things
Yeah.
that we come to think of as Google. So it was like a weird thing to join Google
Yeah.
at the time. And I didn't really know what I was getting into until I joined. And, like the first week, I'm internal and you can look at all the data and you see all the queries and the revenue and everything was open. They didn't have like
Yeah.
very tight controls at the time. I was like, whoa, this thing is going to dominate the next several decades of technology.
That's insane. And it still had this like simple Google logo and the search bar.
Yeah.
Same page, right?
Yeah, just the one thing. Yeah. And it used to be that, everything was just on a web browser, right? We didn't have Chrome, right? So everything was on like Internet Explorer. eBay was considered a credible threat.
Holy moly. How is that?
Well, because Google had lots of queries.
Yeah.
And the queries were oftentimes informational in nature. So, you want to learn about, I don't know, where do we go? You want to learn about what's it like in Delhi, like what's the temperature in Delhi? That's an informational query. That query itself is not worth a lot monetarily.
Gotcha.
Whereas if you're like, oh, I want to go shopping for a new shirt. Sometimes people go to eBay and type in new shirt.
Yeah.
And that's a monetizable query. So there's this kind of camp inside Google that was like, wow, eBay may eat our lunch because they have all the high value queries. We're just serving people the information. Now, fast forward and you can kind of see how this plays is like if you serve every need and people come to trust you around the informational queries, you also win the monetizable queries. And you also see like Amazon now effectively encroaching on some of the monetizable queries today. So there's always change. I mean, that's what's interesting about technology. There's always change. There's nobody who dominates forever in all ways that they always have.
What products did you get to work at Google? Is there anything which you can share?
We had a thing called the Google Search Appliance, which was like this rack mount box that people would put in their data centers to crawl their own corpus of content and build kind of a private search engine for enterprises. And that was like V.01 of what is today, Google Workspace and Google Enterprise. It's like everything that enterprises would buy from Google.
Wow.
The very first one was this Google Search Appliance. I was fortunate to work in some of the core stuff in the ads business. And so we built a thing. We used to have humans had to make review decisions about every ad. Somebody would create a new ad, come join Pesto or whatever,
Yeah.
right? And a human would have to say like, oh, is this an ad that we're going to approve to be served on Google.com, or is it going to be approved to be syndicated out to network partners like AOL? We created a ML to help automate the decisions when people would make a decision about, oh, Sex and the City is not a porn DVD, that's just an entertainment product, right?
Gotcha.
When somebody would make that decision once, the ML would help figure out all of the future decisions involving that kind of thing. So you have to sort of weigh a bunch of factors to understand.
What year is this?
This would have been like, I want to say like 2004, 2005.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't know that things were done in this manner.
It used to
back
be
in the day.
all human, but ultimately we worked on moving the manual review process to happen in many places in the world, India being one of them, which was my last trip to India was, I think, probably like 15, 16, 18 years ago, I don't know.
Oh, wow.
But it was actually to help set some of that up to make it more of a global operation. In Dublin, Ireland was another location where we did a lot of that.
That's awesome.
And then we're working simultaneously on the ML technology to take all of the work that humans, it's like RLHF is kind of similar idea, right? It's take all the work that humans are doing and help feed it into the machine to be able to interpret so that humans don't have to make those same decisions again. They can make new decisions on new content.
Yeah, so many insane experiences at Google. I think building it fundamentally, now when you're telling me, I'm thinking about things more from a first principles perspective, and it's just incredible how these things we ended up consuming on the outside, but they're not like as complex as I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Right?
You almost need like a certain amount of confidence to know that simplicity is okay. And so if you just have google.com and a search query bar and a button, that's like the ultimate in sophistication. It is just a box. And you don't have to convince people that you're smart.
Yeah.
You just have to do something amazing, right?
Yeah.
And behind the scenes, there's so much. It's such a mess, but it serves this very simple, useful experience.
For customers, it's like extremely simple. That's phenomenal. And any interesting stories you can share from Google where things broke, there was too much traffic, the website went down?
You kind of like poke around and understand how people are using the internet, just by sort of analyzing the way kind of content flowed through and the way queries flowed through. And you could use it to actually improve the search engine, improve the advertising systems. And so it's interesting to kind of just like understand from the inside how people were kind of attempting to attack Google and then how you could try to fix it. And it's not obvious when you're just looking at that search box. You don't know all of those things. But like, I remember things like, pharmaceutical ads. There's like a big policy thing. The way trademarks work. Like if I were to run an ad and I write the word pesto in the ad, if a lot of people know about pesto, they may click through my ad, but why am I driving up the cost of your advertising? I like to use the tools internally to figure out new, interesting kind of things that people are discovering and then find ways to sort of fix them and make them, kind of keep any potentially bad behavior from happening and sort of encourage more of the good behavior.
I'm assuming so much chaos and stuff like that. You said, I want more of it. Why is that? You jumped into building startups after that, right?
Yeah. Well, I had observed the rise of social networking. Uh-huh. I was an early user of Friendster, early user of MySpace, and I noticed Facebook's emergence too. And I was like, wow, for as much as I love everything that Google's built and building and like the utility, like the core utility, scalable technology nature of it, Google never figured out how to make a place on the internet.
Well, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. In social networks were these places on the internet. They were like places you go to meet people, to do things, to interact. The internet is all about like where people come to gather.
Yeah.
The utility stuff can fill in the holes around where people gather, what people are, how they're coming together in communities. Maybe in a Discord or a Slack today are places on the internet. Certainly social networks are places on the internet. But Google has none of these places. And I was sitting there saying, like, I think places on the internet are kind of going to be a really big, important thing. And so I left Google with the intention of sort of exploring that idea. Towards the end of that year, got some real traction with what was kind of Facebook had launched their platform, and we ended up exploring that platform a lot and ended up building one of the first really large social games and social gaming networks on kind of the Facebook ecosystem.
That's awesome. What was that network called?
The company was called Green Patch, and we were the first to build a virtual world. I know earlier today we were talking about the farming kind of genre of there's Farm Town and Farmville, and there's
so many.
But that was like a category of content and experience that we pioneered. We had a service called Little Green Patch.
That's insane.
Which was, you'd have like a garden and you send fruit to your friends and you grow fruit with each other. And so it's kind of just this little fun virtual world space.
Gotcha.
But it really hit a nerve. And I think we grew to, I think we were, I don't know, we were probably, I mean, by the time we ended up selling the company to Playdom, which is now part of Walt Disney, we had about 45 million players of the games.
Holy moly.
So we touched a large fraction of the Facebook population.
That's incredible. Yeah. Wow. I didn't know this part of you.
Yeah. I think just like you just learn a lot when you have a company that's, growing and there's, there's all the problems of growth and things are working, but of course things are crashing and there's, there were lawsuits and it was a bit of a mess, as many, early startups turn out to be quite a mess. But it was a fun mess, and a lot of learnings and quick growth being in, kind of trial by fire.
At what point did you start investing?
I don't have a strong recollection of the very first investment I made. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was Cora, but I think Cora was one of the first. And with That's Cora, awesome. I was, it had just, I think I was given an invite, very early, maybe it was like around the beta area. And I came on and it was a place. It was people gathering, and the content was so good. Yeah. It was so good. I was just obsessed with the product.
Yeah.
I just loved the content and the format of having people's knowledge get published in a new way. I volunteered as like an admin to help kind of admin the site a little bit, and then I asked the guys if I could invest. And what happened is they sort of caught lightning in a bottle, and it was explosive like nothing I've ever seen.
How did you get so good at, public speaking, talking about things, expressing yourself, stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, thanks. It's a generous compliment. So I appreciate you kind of offering it as such. I grew up excited about performance in a lot of different ways, and so we grew up playing the piano and singing and performing in theater. And I think one of the formative experiences was this theater that I was a part of, and they used to put on a new show every 2 weeks. Yeah. And so you could never actually memorize all the scripts and all the lines. And you'd be cast in these all kinds of different roles and all kinds of different productions, where you sometimes have to just improvise a bit, and you kind of have to just like go with it. And if it doesn't come out perfect, that's okay. Just keep rolling. That's a thing that feels natural to me because I did it a lot growing up, and so it feels fine for me. I don't ever sweat it. I don't worry too much. Yeah.
Wow. So performance anxiety and fear of failure ends up killing most dreams. And
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you can get over that, it's like a superpower, right? You think about how much performance anxiety you must have any time you're doing anything that involves some amount of risk.
I think I love this advice. The fact that do it for doing it and not for the outcome of it can go a very, very long way. And if you just keep doing it again and again and again and again, you probably will get good at it at some point,
Totally.
right? So that intent is something which is very, very needed, right?
Totally.
Let's talk about Silicon Valley,
Yeah,
right?
let's do it.
Which is the place where probably it has the highest concentration of people with this mindset, just do it mindset.
Yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley is like this weird petri dish that happened, basically, I think it started 40 years ago when people started financing these crazy ideas. And it's something that has, because it exists and because capital accumulates there, and because talent accumulates there, it's lower risk for any given thing, because if something doesn't work, you can always move on to the next thing. And so the culture because of the accumulation of talent and capital, you actually have a lower risk profile, a easier acceptance of failure. And everybody knows somebody who has had some massive outsized success. Maybe they founded some company or joined something, really big early on. And in those stories, like you have a random roommate who actually, is like a, early engineer at Snapchat or something, right? And you're like, oh, this actually can happen. This actually can work. Willingness to believe and willingness to see something that could work is what really has driven Silicon Valley. But I think that's now a global phenomenon.
That's incredible.
Technology is a great enabler. It gives small groups of people massive leverage on their work.
Yeah.
And so, how long is it going to be before we see the first billion-dollar company built by a single person?
Yeah.
Right? Like that is something that's going to happen, and it's just a matter of time because all the tools are available. And now it's just how do you synthesize and remix and rework those tools to be useful to humanity and to find customers that want to pay you for the way you've uniquely assembled those tools.
That's awesome. Do you think remote is going to play a big part in it? I think as tech hubs gets built, access to talent is going to become a thing.
So I'm a fan of it. I have not seen it become an impediment to a company's ability to build, but I do think remote is maybe an accelerant to these new tech hubs getting built, because in a sense, it takes some ideas that may feel like they're, location dependent. Let's say, maybe people feel like Silicon Valley has a bit of monopoly on certain types of ideas and they should be more distributed, but they aren't yet. Well, remote lets a global group participate in those ideas, learn about those, but while living in their local place. And then they can take those ideas and they can germinate, and maybe they, on iteration 2, they're doing something local with other people that happen to be local. And it's a way to sort of export the ideas and globalize the ideas and make people comfortable with them. So I think remote work is almost like you get to dip your toe in a bunch of new ideas, and then you can actually incorporate them into your life. You pick the ones that work for you and you sort of discard the ones that don't.
Do you think the serendipity which ecosystems, have, like Silicon Valley does, do you think that serendipity can also be replicated remotely, or is that something which is incredibly hard to do?
Well, there's something about being in person when you bump into people at a coffee shop or a party in a low stakes environment where you're not trying to do business, you're just bumping into people and ideas collide and, oh, you're doing that? I heard about that. Did you check that thing out? And those kinds of collisions, I think, happen in a different way when you're in person, kind of you're bumping into each other in a coffee shop. But I don't think that means that's the only way serendipity can work. And I think there's tons of serendipity on GitHub, right? Like GitHub is a hub where you can sort of notice a project that you think is interesting, have a pull request, you can actually work on it. You could meet the maintainer, you can actually interact with them and propose differences and changes.
Do you think we are like a couple of years away from concluding that in-person serendipity, why would it not happen online?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the product that Apple is kind of announced with the Vision Pro is really exciting for that idea, because I think they've really gotten far ahead in investing in like, how do you make a virtual experience feel more in person and natural? So I think in the fullness of time, if you say like fast forward the world 100 years, like crazy time frame, yes, absolutely 100%.
My head is spinning.
but I mean, it's just like obvious that everybody's going to be able to have the same kind of serendipity I talked about in the coffee shop with the global world internet.
This was such an incredible ride. We talked about pretty much everything.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at this as a young person who is trying to figure out, I want to work in tech, I'm a technologist, and I'm trying to figure out where should I pay attention, what is that thing or things, let's say, right now, which they should focus on in their careers, aka what are the things you are excited to invest in?
Right. I think one of the big changes in the world that we are just at the beginning of, in that like there's a few people talking about or whispering about, but I think people don't make a big enough deal about it, is open source. I think open source is when we have software tools, right? Mm-hmm. That are just like basically internet applications, a bunch of code that you can ship and replicate everywhere. Like, why do we have these toll booths around our software? Well, people want to make a living and build companies. Like, that's fine. Like, if the structure enables and supports that, then great. But I think for most of these things, you don't actually have the need for kind of a corporation to live on top of most of the software we use. I think most of the software we use should kind of be written and contributed and pulled in thousands of different directions by people's individual needs, instead of prioritized on a roadmap by a product manager inside a single corporation. So any corporation can only do the top 3 priorities for this quarter. Whereas if you have like open source software, you get people contributing random idea number 67 on the priority list, but I really care about it, and so I'm going to build that thing, and now the whole world has access to that. And so I think it's not like we've never seen success in open source. We've seen plenty of successes, HashiCorp and MuleSoft and stuff like that. But I think it's underappreciated how big a movement open source will be, and how impactful it will be, and how commercial it will be. I think with a lot of technology, you want to be a little bit early when people are like, why would you work on that? There's no opportunity. You can't make money doing that.
Gotcha.
But you discover what is interesting about it because you're showing up at the party. And these don't always all pay off, but you kind of are subject to lower competition. You get to discover more. You get to carve a path. Now, some of these things will just fail or not be very meaningful or not be commercial. But if your goal is to build something commercial, I think you should play at the edges of what's weird, and then take your learnings from those edges, and you might discover that there are commercial opportunities there. Don't dismiss things that you're interested in because you can't necessarily figure out what the business is. Like, be a little patient and say, like, I'm interested in this. I think other people will be interested. Let me pursue it a bit. Gotcha. And then maybe a business will arise.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. This was incredible.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's always a blast when we get to hang out, and especially in person.
Sure.
And
no, thank you so much for being here. Awesome.